I recorded my entire intro and forgot that my mic wasn't on. So we're going to be talking about symmetrical skateboards. We're going to be talking about the pros, the cons, why I skate a symmetrical skateboard, but why it might not actually work for you, or some of the flaws to skating a symmetrical skateboard. Symmetrical skateboards. If you don't know what a symmetrical skateboard is, you may be thinking to yourself, wait, aren't all skateboards symmetrical? They look the same. To the untrained eye, a skateboard does typically look symmetrical, but in reality, most skateboards that you get are going to have a tail that's a tiny bit smaller, usually somewhere around 6.25 inches from the back bolts to the back of the tail, and a nose that's a little bit longer, usually around 7 inches. So typically around like 3/4 of an inch longer. When you just glance at it, you might not notice it unless you've been skating for a while and your eyes are kind of trained to noticing that difference. The other thing is a nose is typically more bold in its shape and a little more round, whereas a tail is typically a little more tapered in and a little more narrow. So this board right here, this is a Heroin symmetrical deck. I think its measurements are kind of halfway between a nose and a tail, but because of its roundness, it reminds me a little more of a nose. So I sometimes call it a twin nose. Really, it's just a symmetrical deck. Twin noses work better for me. This Heroin deck has been pretty much the perfect shape for me. So yeah, I skate an 8.25. I'm also an 8.25 Venture trucks if you're curious. These are the Venture V8s, so I can move the wheelbase in and out depending on how I like it. The reason that's good is because this deck in particular has a 14-inch wheelbase, which is pretty small. The standard is 14.25, so I can set my wheelbase on the Ventures out a little bit since it's a narrow wheelbase, and it ends up kind of being a good middle ground wheelbase. That's the reason for the adjustable wheelbase, which I do like if I change from deck to deck and I want to make those decks feel similar. My wheels are 97X Formula Bones. They are the classic shape, the V1 shape. I bet they are probably down to about 50 or maybe 49 millimeters now. I have Bronson G3 bearings, which just last so long. For me personally, they last a lot better than Bones Reds do. So similar performance, but last a lot longer than Bones Reds. That is my setup. Let's get to some skating. When we skate, we're going to talk about the pros and the cons of why people would skate a symmetrical deck and why it might not actually work for you. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Who knows? Maybe this video will help you make that decision. Maybe not. Maybe you just care about watching and finding out about my setup. During my brief warm-up, my tricks weren't feeling super good or super consistent. So I'm just going to do a little flat ground and try to get my tricks feeling a little bit better today. I think honestly the biggest reason to skate a symmetrical deck is simplicity. And I love simplicity with my skating and my skateboarding and having one less thing to think about. So with a traditional tail and a traditional nose, one side is engineered to be better to kick off of and to pop off of, and the other side is engineered better to flick off of. So the smaller side gives a little more pop for the height on your tricks. Oh! And then the wider, more bold side is engineered for, oh, I'm telling you, tricks are not feeling very smooth today. The wider, more bold side is engineered to flick off of better for kick flips and heel flips. So a symmetrical deck sometimes is going to either cut those in the middle, or it's going to lean a little more towards a twin nose or a twin tail. Let's say I'm skating and I'm trying to do 2 tricks in a row, and I'm going to do those 2 tricks in a row right now. Let's say I want to do a pop shove it followed by a heel flip. Pretty simple. Okay, let's do that. So now one side of my board is facing forward. I do a pop shove it. Now that side of the board's facing backwards. and I do a heel flip. Now you can think of any number of combinations. Throw a 180 in there, and that's going to throw it off even more. Throw a varial flip in there. That's going to throw the rhythm off. Well, now all of a sudden when we're planning out our lines, we're limited on which tricks we can do if the board can only face one specific direction. If I can only do a heel flip, oh, geez, my tricks feel so strange today. Oh my goodness, and that just chipped up. Oh my gosh. Well, that's actually gonna give us, when I landed primo right there, look at how chipped up that side of the board just got, which is gonna bring us to one of our negatives of a twin nose or a twin tail. I can't believe that just happened. So I think you get the idea though. The skating a deck that can only go one direction can really throw off what tricks you're able to do in a line, because you can't be skating the board backwards. Let's do first kickflip of the day. Second reason I don't like a traditional popsicle is because your pop timing will now change depending on what skate stance you're in. And I might not be the best person to speak on this because I kind of am not the best at nollie, fakie, switch, and those tricks. But for me, it makes sense in my head that if I pop in a standard stance and then I pop nollie or fakie like this, and again, I'm not the best person to speak on this because my nollie and switch are pretty trash. But what I've noticed is most people, see, my switch is a struggle. What I've noticed is most people, when they skate a popsicle deck, traditional, oh gosh, what most people do is they, when doing switch and nollie, they actually pop off of the nose and flick off of the tail. Now, I mentioned earlier that the tail is engineered for better pop and the nose is engineered for better flick, right? So if I'm skating the board backwards for switch and nollie, which are already my more difficult trick, I struggle at switch, I struggle at nollie. Why would I want my board to be facing the direction that the board's not engineered to go? Why would I want to be popping off of a nose and flicking off of a tail? It doesn't make sense in my brain. For me, it makes more sense to have that happy medium between my ollie and my switch ollie, for me to have the pop timing and the flick ability to be the same for both of those. Makes a lot more sense to me. The TLDR version of that is you can skate the deck front or back and have the same experience regardless of which way the board is facing. I'm going to land one of every of my basic tricks. So let's start with an ollie. You know, it's a strange day when even your ollies feel a little bit weird. Let's do every stance though. Fakie. Oh. All right, fakie ollie. Nollie, which I always struggle with. That was better. My least favorite, switch ollie. I kind of have gone through my warm-up routine now twice, simply because my tricks haven't felt super comfortable today. So I've felt that I've just needed some extra warm-up. If you've been watching my channel for a while, You know that I struggle with 180s, and I've actually received a lot of advice on my 180s, and I am trying to put all that into practice, and it's still not really working. I mean, this right here is proof that skateboarding and progression in skateboarding is not the same for everybody, because I have been skating fairly regularly for a couple months now, doing front side 180s every session, and they still feel uncomfortable. And I know there's people who pick up skating and learn front side 180s way faster than this. But anyways, that's fine. That's the beauty of skateboarding. There we go. All right, let's get a kickflip and then we're moving on. Yeah, let's talk about why you might not want to skate a symmetrical deck. So, first one's bushings, actually. If you skate your skateboard the same way all the time, you might not even notice, but your bushings will break in differently, whether they're the front bushing or the back bushing. And if you don't skate a symmetrical deck, it's very important when you change out your deck to keep the same truck in the front and the same truck in the back, because they've broken in a certain way based on how you skate and how your body weight affects the bushings. Now, with a symmetrical deck, those bushings are going to break in significantly more even, because sometimes you're skating one way, sometimes you're skating the other way, and it's all going to balance out. If you do a good job of making sure that you've matched your truck tightness front and back, you're going to get to the point where you can't tell which bushing is which. And that's the goal. That's the dream. That's the ideal setup for a symmetrical board, when you can't tell one end from the other. That's in a perfect world. The truth is, when you get your bushings in manufacturing, in the course of you skating, there's going to be some differences. There's going to be some imperfections. Let's try with the shove it out. I actually got a set of trucks from Thunder, and they came, and one bushing was super, super loose, and the other bushing was super, super tight, even though the same amount of threads were showing on the kingpin. And I ended up having to get each truck the exact same tightness. I ended up having to have like 4 threads showing on one side and no threads showing on the other side. Now, that was a manufacturing flaw. That was a set of trucks I got where just one of the bushings maybe was slightly smaller, or maybe when they injected the, urethane in the bushing, maybe the durometer just ended up being a little bit softer in that one side compared to the other side. So in manufacturing, they can get pretty good, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get their bushings perfectly identical every time. So I ended up having to switch out my bushings, and I switched them out with Crux bushings, which ended up being pretty awesome. And I still sometimes skate those Thunder trucks. But that's something to be aware of, is that even though these companies try their best, they might not be manufactured absolutely 100% perfect front and back. Once you start skating a symmetrical deck, you become kind of hyper aware to the feeling of each end of the board, and it can actually kind of increase your board madness in trying to get the front of your board to match the back of your board, and vice versa, even though there's not really a front and back, but you know what I mean. Okay. It's not super easy necessarily to get the tightness of your trucks equal front and back. Now let's focus on number 2, and I'm going to roll the board towards the camera to show you number 2. And that's that even with all that hard work, your board's not going to be perfect. Now, that actually was a pretty good roll. I mean, that was just barely rolling left right there. But then obviously, let's use our brain power for a second. If it's rolling left that way, if I flipped the board around and rolled it towards the camera, which way would it have rolled? It would have rolled to the right. Oh. Which means, depending on which way you're skating, your board's going to have ever so slightly a lean one way or the other. And if you can't tell your nose from your tail, which is the whole point of a symmetrical deck, then you're going to be hopping on the board and having to make those micro adjustments kind of on the fly. Now, I have noticed when the board is as close, when the board is rolling and just barely turning left, I actually don't notice it. But that could be something that bothers you. I have had a deck where it rolled. I have had a deck where the deck rolled way left, and I could not skate it as a symmetrical deck because every time I hopped on the board, I didn't know which way that I needed to put my body weight. This one is close enough to the middle right now that I have that it's not going to affect me, but that's something to be aware of. Again, going back to bushing and truck imperfections. Okay. So let's talk about what happened earlier in my session. So earlier in my session, I landed primo, and it actually pulled up this side of the board right here. I also have ever so slightly a chip here, which isn't bad, and I don't really notice that. But let's imagine that this chip was worse. So imagine that in your brain. Well, now one side of your board is chipped up, and the other side of your board is not chipped up. Well, if that chip is right where you need to flick for a kickflip, I would think that could impact your kickflip if I have a chip on my kickflip spot. Now, if I was not skating a symmetrical deck, that wouldn't be that big a deal because I would just adjust to that's just the way this board is. But because sometimes I'm flicking off of one end, sometimes I'm flicking off the other end, if my flick is different, that could really have an impact on my skating. Now, I am pretty bummed actually. I do think my heel flips will actually be impacted by that, which means my heel flip might flip differently if my foot passes over this than it will on this side. So now that might be something, and maybe that impact isn't even real, but because I'm trying to make my board symmetrical, that gets in my head, that gets in my brain, and it tells me, okay, now my board is different one side and the other, and that might mess up my heel flips. Oh, I did forget a positive earlier of a symmetrical board is if you're always popping off the same tail, 90% of your tricks and you don't skate a ton of switch and nollie, you're going to wear out one side of your tail twice as fast. Whereas on a symmetrical board, you wear the board out very evenly. What about manufacturing flaws on the deck? I have gotten decks before that are ever so slightly warped because they've maybe sat in cold storage and then been moved to warm storage or whatever. Wood does warp with humidity as well. Wood's an organic material and it will warp over time and change shape over time. There's a YouTuber, Adriano. He skates with Ben DeGrow a bunch, but he talked about how he was skating, trying out in a shod wear deck, and he noticed one side of the board, the tail, was a little bit lower and less of an angle than the other side, even though it was supposed to be symmetrical. I believe that probably happened because I think the person he got the board from, Ben DeGrow, had been skating the deck probably in one direction, not as a twin tail, and continuing to put pop pressure on one side of the board rather than the other probably lowered that kicktail a little bit. Oh, come on. Now, as a result of watching that video, I went and measured all of my symmetrical decks, kicktails that I had in my basement that I had previously skated that are just too worn out to keep skating. And every single kicktail was the same angle and was the same size. So I think either, yes, that was fun. I think either Ben DeGrow had skated that deck and made it not so symmetrical due to how he was skating it, or vice versa. It just came as a manufacturing error, but I have not personally ever had that manufacturing error on a twin nose or a twin tail. Those are just some things to be aware of as you do skate twin noses and twin tails, is if your board's not perfectly symmetrical, it can get in your brain and it can mess with you. But with all that being said, I still personally prefer skating a twin nose or a twin tail over skating a traditional board, even knowing those downfalls. And it's easier for me to skate and experience that freedom of not having to pay attention to which way my board is going, front ways or back ways. For me, I know those flaws. I know that any imperfection on a symmetrical deck on your board gets magnified. But I know for me, it's still worth it to skate a symmetrical deck. I'm going to put a little bit of wood glue in there and I'm going to clamp that down. And I think that will solve my problem right there. Did I cover everything? I think I covered everything. That's all for the video. Thanks for watching. Let me know what your experience with symmetrical decks has been. If you like them, hate them, have never tried them. Let's get one kickflip for the road. There we go. All right. Thanks for watching. Catch you in the next one. Peace.